You're watching Reason and Theology, a show dedicated to evangelizing non-Catholics and helping Catholics better understand their faith.
Would you give priority to Mark or Matthew? Some say that, Mark was written first and that the other Gospels borrow from Mark, and others say that Matthew was written first. What's your view?
The broad consensus, but it's not as strong as it was 40, 50 years ago. The broad consensus among biblical scholars is that Mark's Gospel was the first one written. Now, there is in the Apostolic Fathers, you start with Papias, you get Irenaeus and some others who say that Papias says that Matthew wrote something. He doesn't call it the Gospel, and this has been typically overlooked by scholars. Matthew wrote the Logia Jesu, the sayings of Jesus, in Hebrew, and everybody interpreted them as best they could. This is what Papias says. Now, the sayings of Jesus, people naturally assume, well, this must mean the gospel, but he doesn't call it the gospel. Not only that, but the sayings of Jesus can be neatly packaged into 5 great sermons that we have in the Gospel of Matthew. The rest of his gospel is really anchored to those 5 great sermons, like the Sermon on the Mount, the Olivet Discourse, those kinds of messages. And so I suspect, and there's kind of it's a small minority, but a growing group of scholars who are seeing this, that what Matthew did was he may have actually produced something like pamphlets that included some of the sayings of Jesus. So here's one on the Sermon on the Mount, here's one on the Olivet Discourse. This kind of stuff would just circulate. And he would have written it in Aramaic. But then when Mark's gospel gets produced, there's a growth in Matthew's readership beyond just Palestine, and it gets into Syria. And we have strong evidence that Matthew had an influence in Syria. So at that point, now we're starting to get some readers who are saying, we'd like to see what the historical context is for these saints. And so they are asking Matthew, can you put it in this kind of a context? Now, this is speculative, but I'm trying to put all of the data together from the early fathers in light of the external evidence that we have, as well as the internal evidence that we have. And so his audience has expanded, as we can see very plainly in his gospel, that Jesus is saying at the end, you're going to preach the gospel, you're going to make disciples of all the nations. Well, that's not just Jews. Matthew's gospel starts out as a very Jewish gospel. It ends up being a gospel to the Gentiles. And I think that that's where we start to see in his gospel this influence of wanting to get beyond just the Hebrew or the Aramaic community and getting it to the broader audience, which would be in Greek. Okay, now you have Irenaeus, who says Matthew wrote first. Irenaeus wanted to have an apostle be the first author of one of the Gospels. It gives him more authority. I mean, we want to have an apostle be an authority, a writer of one of the Gospels, and to be the very first one. Man, that's a big deal. But Papias does not say that Matthew wrote a Gospel. Irenaeus comes after Papias, of course, and he's saying Matthew wrote this Gospel, and it's the first Gospel. I think Irenaeus was half right. Matthew wrote that Gospel. The external testimony of the Church Fathers is absolutely unanimous across the board for all 4 Gospels. Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and John wrote John. There's no disagreement among these early fathers. So when Irenaeus says Matthew wrote Matthew, that's undisputed, at least as far as the fathers are concerned. But then he says, but he wrote first. Irenaeus had some things that were some wacky ideas about chronology, about the life of Jesus, the life of Paul and Peter and things like that, but he was pretty good in terms of authorship. So when you also read Papias, he talks about, and the other church fathers right on down the line, that Mark did not get his gospel from himself. He got it by following Peter. So here's one of the issues. People say, well, let's follow what the tradition says. Matthew wrote first. Well, that's Irenaeus' tradition, but that's not the oldest tradition. And when they say that, they are ignoring the other half of the tradition, that Mark got his gospel from Peter. Let me frame this. This is a lot of moving parts, and I'll try to make it simpler. If Matthew wrote first, those who hold to Matthean priority would say, surely Mark copied sections out of Matthew for his gospel. But how can that be if those same church fathers say that Mark got his gospel from Peter, not from Matthew? So you're buying half the tradition, not the other half of the tradition. But if Mark wrote first in Greek and Matthew wrote the sayings of Jesus in Aramaic, and as his ministry expanded into Greek-speaking areas, people said, we want to get a framework for these sayings. And so he used Mark's gospel essentially as that framework. Then it harmonizes with saying that Mark wrote the first gospel, Mark got his gospel from Peter, and Matthew also wrote a gospel. It's interesting that 600 of the 660 verses that are in Matthew are also in Mark. That's 90% plagiarism, if you want to consider it plagiarism. I think what he's doing is, as an apostle, he's putting his stamp of approval on what Mark has actually written. There's some evidence that suggests that Luke is doing the same thing. So that would summarize what I'd say about this in terms of the external evidence. Let me just touch on another aspect of this. In Bart Ehrman's book, Forge, where he says the biblical writers are either pseudonymous or anonymous, we don't know who they are, but we got it all wrong. One of the things he talks about is how the internal evidence of how Matthew couldn't possibly have written Matthew. The Greek is really good, for one thing. Well, you'd expect that from a tax collector, wouldn't you? He's collecting taxes from Jews and Gentiles. The guy's going to be solidly bilingual. And so Ehrman says all are written by Gentiles. And he also says that that the internal evidence suggests that Matthew did not write Matthew, and he goes through with Luke and John as well. The problem is what he completely ignores is the patristic evidence. And it was Eusebius in the early 4th century who wrote ecclesiastical history or church history, whose primary occupation, it seemed, up until the time that he wrote that by the year 324, before he ever met Emperor Constantine, was to find out who wrote which books of the New Testament and to find out whether the church accepted these books. The Gospels were all accepted by the early churches as written by those people whose names are attributed to that in these very early manuscripts, not part of the Gospel, but you'll have in our oldest manuscripts that have Matthew chapter 1 or Mark or Luke or John chapter 1, they'll have a title there, according to John or according to Mark. So we know that from the very earliest time, those titles were added. What Ehrman doesn't do is he doesn't look at this external evidence, the patristic evidence, which is universally, almost universally, against his viewpoint. He ignores it because it doesn't help his case. You have to look at the internal evidence and the external evidence. These same church fathers say that Paul wrote these 13 letters, and the Greek fathers said Paul also wrote Hebrews. The Latin fathers disagreed with that. What's interesting is the church fathers have a lot of doubt about 2 Peter, but ultimately they accept it. So they're not just unanimous, slam dunk, here's the stamp, we approve this, this is by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And one other thing, if you want to have a gospel written by an apostle, you'd expect the early church to make up the idea of, oh, we have an apostle who wrote this gospel. But how do you explain the Gospel of Mark? Shouldn't it be called the Gospel according to Peter? I mean, after all, if Mark gets it from Peter, and this is the unanimous testimony of the ancient church fathers, then why isn't it called the Gospel according to Peter? Well, that tells us that because they're honest about that, we probably expect them to be honest about Matthew, Luke, and John as well. Because they're not foisting this on a gospel. They're saying this is the early evidence that we have. There are some scholars who are even claiming now that those titles were part of the original gospels themselves.